Hey all, this paper is one I presented at the Pop Cultural Research Network's recent Bridgerton conference, and this conference, or the network, is affiliated with the University of New South Wales in Australia. So let's begin. Ever since Bridgerton appeared on our screens in 2020, the makers compelled viewers to suspend all logical belief systems to entertain a world of a multiracial escapism uh, entertain a world of multiracial escapism of a super rich regency, whereas implied racism doesn't exist, but capitalism clearly does. This paper situates debates of colonialism and chattel enslavement back into the regency world, and does so via a reframing of the ton, not as rich, nice liberals, but as global terrorists. This paper is based on one section of a book chapter I did as well for Valerie Frankel's edited collection adapting Bridgerton, published by Macfarlane. I talked about the program as a phantom limb of the anti-racism industrial complex. It also follows a prior journal article where I write about Jane Austen's work as a mechanism that reproduces whiteness, not through what Jane says, but more so what she does not say. Through much of her work, readers of the books and viewers of the adaptations are expected to believe many of her characters are super rich without considering the fact their wealth and thus permission to escape into the English or British countryside is upheld by violent systems like chattel enslavement. My journal article looks at this in Austen, but can be reapplied to shows like Bridgerton as well. That article was part of a cluster um, I did with friends and fellow colleagues, historian Dr. Kerry Sinanan, entertainment journalist Amanda Ray Prescott, and historical costuming expert Bianca Hernandez Knight. In 2022, our friend Adrian Garcia Specht, whose background is an anti-colonial analysis on film and literature, and also herself is a Jane Austen and also a particularly passionate Elizabeth Gaskell fan, hosted our panel discussion on our cluster, a virtual JaneCon. My prior work, built on Edward Said's debates on Mansfield Park, extending his synthesis to think about what whiteness scholars and researchers may talk about as white terrorism, but in Austen and Austen adjacent contexts, from Emma to Bridgerton to Mr. Malcolm's List, and the stories between. When enslavement was abolished in the British Empire in 1834, at least on paper, half of the £20 million compensation money paid to the enslavers went to the nearly 3,000 absentee enslavers living in Britain. Economics historians would describe absentee slave owners or absentee enslavers as people managing enslaved people, as people in managing enslaved people, and the plantations they worked on, accumulating the profits from that work while living in the comfort of Britain, psychologically and geographically removed from the terror of the plantation. For Bridgerton fans willing to participate in the growing pains of anti-racism, they need to consider the super rich characters in this program did not just become super rich ethically, and for those living in that so-called alternative London, many of them could be described or discussed within this framing of absentee slave ownership. Between December 2020 and, say, February 2021, there was a lot of discussion about Bridgerton being a post-racial fantasy, which at the time I thought was a load of nonsense, to be honest. The utopia arguments of a regency world where black people are suddenly accepted, I couldn't buy into that. And I say this because although race wasn't explicitly mentioned at the beginning, the world viewers are exposed to is one of inheritance structures, bloodlines, and birthrights, property, and the right to property. So to call families like the Bridgertons a bunch of colonizing racists flies in the face of all the news media that praised the show for its choices to cast black characters in lead roles, critiques of colorism notwithstanding. Yet, while I remember being told that I was looking into this too much, and that Bridgerton is a post-racial utopia. A closer reading of Series 1 illustrates a world taking the concept of property away for just a minute, where race and racism exist, and everybody in the world are subject to its rules. In episode 3, for example, Art of the Swoon, there is a conversation between Simon, the Duke of Hastings, and Lady Danbury, where Danbury says, I understand you believe love and devotion, affection and attachment trite and frivolous. Have you any idea those very things are precisely what have allowed a new day to begin to dawn in their society? Look at our Queen and King. Look at their marriage and everything it has been doing for us, allowing us to become. We were two separate houses divided by colour until the king fell in love with one of us. Love, your grace, conquers all. Effectively, Lady Danbury is claiming that mixed unions abolished racism in this alternative fantasy of the world, and particularly the union between a black woman and a white man in that sense. Um, so, with that added context given by Lady Danbury, where there was once a time when racism existed in this world, I have yet to be convinced that it ever went away. Um, the writers acknowledge racialization and thus racism exist or existed, yet they continue to peddle the fantasy as race interrupts the idyllic space. So they have capitalism without racism. There is also a later visceral example between Will Mondrick, the boxer, and Lord Featherington in Oceans Apart. Viewers are told Will's father was a soldier in Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment made of formerly enslaved black people in America's War for Independence, which is actually a real unit of enslaved soldiers fighting on the side of the British monarchy. Popular historian and British broadcaster David Olusoga writes that Lord Dunmore calculated that freeing and arming slaves might shock the rebels that they would submit to the crown. His action had the opposite effect. Even before 1775, Dunmore had a reputation for being insensitive and autocratic. Now he was bitterly condemned by the colonists for exciting an insurrection of slaves, so a slave rebellion. In a society that had known slave rebellions, placing guns in the hands of black men was transgressing the ultimate taboo. In the mind of some southern planters, Dunmore had turned the rebellion into a fight over the right to hold slaves, writes Olusoga in Black and British. Will's now dead father fought for the in-text version of this regiment. His role was not due to British decency, but Britain's own political self-interest, under what historian and sociologist Cheryl Harris writes about in her 1993 essay Whiteness as Property, which is it's in the name. So the recruitment of enslaved people from American plantations was the British monarchy's way of undermining the rebels. It was an economic warfare to strip America of its property and destabilize the economy. Now, the next part, so that's the first half of my paper. The next part of my paper shows that Bridgerton was never post-racial from the start, because where capitalism exists, so must racism. Even with these inconsistencies in the writers' rooms of trying to do a show that doesn't discuss race, but still having capitalist structures, we still have the issue of a super rich elite living on these huge estates and huge estates, and also like London townhouses and that sort of things, which cost a lot of money to maintain. As the public were bamboozled by the fact of black actors in a Regency show, which is fine. Simon may have become the Jane Austen, Mr. Darcy stand-in for 19th century capitalism. Shondaland and co were trying to make capitalism, for lack of a better term, sexy. He is the richest man in town, and yet we are never told how he made his money. The fact Simon is black in this alternative London is of little consequence when the realer history of absentee slave ownership also shows there were a few black people living in Britain who owned enslaved people and plantations in the colonies. Few illustrate this better than the life of aristocrat Nathaniel Wells. His father was the plantation owner William Wells on the island of St. Kitts, and his mother was an enslaved woman called Juggy. Born into enslavement when he was 9 years old in 1783, Nathaniel Wells went to be schooled in England and when his father died in 1794, he inherited his father's property, including plantations and the humans that worked on them. Some were his relatives. In 1802, he bought Piercefield House and became a Justice of the Peace in 1806, and then Sheriff of Monmouthshire in Wales in 1818. He married twice in his lifetime. Wales is remembered in that area of Wales as a country gentleman. In the civilities that we see characters like Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. But like Wales, it is more than likely Darcy acquired his wealth through enslavement, and other forms of colonial interest. For example, other things like maybe the East India Company as another example. Um, when viewers are taken to Cliveden, in Bridgerton, the estate Simon inherited from his father, his tenants respect him, but we are never told how his family got rich. The broader focus on the release of Bridgerton was on more diversity and period drama, not the more complex historical and social questions that exist when you start making black characters the faces of 19th century capitalism. Just like the works of Jane Austen, Cliveden Castle was built by empire, literally. Shondaland, or whoever makes these choices, chose to use North Mims Park in Hertfordshire, Wilton House in Wiltshire, and Badminton House in Gloucestershire as filming locations without really opening a public discussion about the country house and the slave trade. In fact, according to the University College London database made by historians Catherine Hall and colleagues, where they digitized the slave compensation records, residents at North Mims, in particular, between 1700 and 1850, enslaved 690 people between them, with plantations on the islands of Jamaica and Antigua. Badminton House further benefited from an injection of £20,000 for interior refurbishments, which is billions of pounds in today's money, as its owner had traceable links with the slave trade. Madge Dresser writes in Slavery and the British Country House that Henry Somerset, later the Duke of Beaufort, refashioned Badminton House between 1664 and 1691, finishing the grand interior by the late 1680s. It seems significant that in 1682 the first Duke had married Rebecca Child, the daughter of the London merchant Josiah Child, whose marriage portion was estimated £25,000, again, millions in today's money. Her father, best known as the director of the East India Company, was involved in the Caribbean slave trade before going on to become a founder member, director, and made a shareholder of the Royal Africa Company, which, to my knowledge, was the largest slave trading company in the history of the slave trade, and is the company that Edward Colston worked for, and it was started by Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, the future James II, as well. So it's a slave trading corporation in every meaning of that term, corporation, a human trafficking corporation. Much the same, the Bridgertons are one of the richest in the ton, and we're never told how they made their money either. They are so wealthy that when Cressida Cowper dropped the £20,000 blackmail threat against Colin Bridgerton, I think it might have been series 3, he merely brushed it off as something his family could pay off as a large expenditure. If characters like Simon, Anthony Bridgerton, and Violet Bridgerton are representative for the ton, we could also argue that the debutante culture fans have grown to love was also built by empire money, including fascination with ballroom events, further to white cotton muslin shirts worn by the men. In the decades prior to the Bridgerton years, cotton production enriched Manchester. Matthew Stallard further writes for The Guardian that the annual US cotton crop grew from 9,000 bales to 210,000 between 1790 and 1800. During the same period, the number of cotton mills in Manchester had grown from 3 to 19, and the population had increased to more than 70,000. Even though Britain had ended its involvement in the slave trade in 1807, the reliance of the town's development and prosperity on enslavement actually deepened year by year. from virtually zero in 1790, raw cotton from the US made up 40% of British imports in the 1800s, 50% in the 1810s, and 71% in the 1820s. So, to conclude, this paper has aimed to talk about how the history happening off screen in Bridgerton is vital to understanding the mechanisms of economics on screen. It would be better to think about the ton not as a place of rich, nice liberals that accept black people, no questions asked, but as a community whose associations with one another can be seen through readings of the slave trade. As viewers, we can be more critical of Regency romance stories. Michelle Rolfe Trio's Silence in the Past is a good place to start our thinking, showing how broadcasters have as much sway in what history is believed as, say, academic texts, arguably greater in my opinion. Academic texts discussing this history often talk to themselves, so the screen has a responsibility to show people that escapism has a cost, and in the words of Henry Hill from Goodfellas, um, our murderers come with smiles. Thank you very much. And as always, like the rest of my videos, if you have any questions or comments and so forth, leave the comments in the comment section, or you can send me an email as well via treyventour.com/contact.